I'm Afshin Ratansi. We're going underground as the comparative success of different coronavirus responses takes center stage in Saudi Arabia at the 15th summit of the G20, representing most of the world economy. Coming up on the show, will any of the G20 countries bring up the world's worst humanitarian crisis, Yemen, when they're hosted today by the Saudi autocrats who bomb and blockade it, backed up by UK arms? We speak to the man in the white suit, broadcaster Martin Bell, who has reported from war zones all over the world about the arguable mainstream media blackout of a country facing the largest famine the world has ever seen. And dispatches from the front line of Nagorno-Karabakh with legendary journalist Peter Oborne. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, Saudi Arabia today plays host to a virtual G20 summit representing most of the world economy. But while coronavirus will be at the top of the agenda, what are the world's worst humanitarian crises? The one in Yemen, the one armed to the teeth by Britain despite the evidence of war crimes. Joining me now is former British Member of Parliament and legendary war reporter and now UNICEF UK Ambassador Martin Bell. Martin, thanks so much for coming on. I know you're coming on in your own capacity here. So today begins the G20 summit. Do you expect Yemen to be brought up at the G20 summit?
I certainly do. There are many countries in which there are powerful forces arguing against continuing to supply sophisticated systems to the Saudi-led coalition. There is deep concern in many countries, including ours in the UK, about the role of the Saudi-led Air Force, about attacks on civilians. I think in the last 5 years of the war, there have been an average of one air raid every 10 days, and the targeting seems to have been totally indiscriminate, with school children being killed, a bus hit schools and so on. So the concern is there. I don't think the delegates will be doing their job if they confine the agenda to the coronavirus.
Well, Boris Johnson's Minister Liz Truss contended that there are isolated incidents that may have breached international law. Very different from what you're saying.
I think it's very different from what a lot of people are saying, including observers on the ground and human rights groups. These seems to be a pattern of indiscriminate attacks, of targeting going wrong. I think this seems to me a forum when this can reasonably be raised. Maybe it's a good thing that it is happening in Saudi Arabia, because they need to be told. And they, as I said, the delegates won't be doing their job unless they do raise this issue forcefully.
Good also because, well, Boris Johnson, when he was Foreign Secretary, he said he didn't want independent inquiries into British arms sales to Saudi Arabia as regards Yemen. He said the Saudis have the best insight into their own procedures and will be able to conduct the most thorough and conclusive investigations into the kinds of allegations you're making.
I don't think many people would agree with that. I think we all have to do what we can. Look, I'm not in politics anymore, but I was for 10 years on the Ethical Oversight Committee of a British electronics company. And 18 months ago, I discovered that they were intending to sell what they called stores release systems to the Saudi Air Force. Well, they're bidding for the contract, and the stores being released were bombed. So at that point, I resigned. I couldn't both stay on the board of that company and work for UNICEF. So we all do what we can. And, you know, the House of Commons is also a good forum to raise these concerns. I haven't heard any convincing defense of these arms sales from Liz Truss, from Boris Johnson, from anybody.
Well, even though they are robust arms sale regimens in place in this country, even though, as I said, isolated incidents. I mean, did you do that after you actually visited Yemen as the UNICEF ambassador? You might have to remind us what you saw when you went there.
Yes, I actually visited. I couldn't go now, partly because I'm too old, and partly because it's too dangerous, and it's hard to get in. This was actually 10 years ago. They'd had 6 wars in 6 years, and I saw even there. This is before the disintegration of the central government, requiring their support by the Saudi coalition. But I saw the effects even then of these air raids. I held the hand of a 9-year-old girl who was suffering from PTSD, having been bombed out of her home in northern Yemen. And she didn't know who she was or where she was. It was it was a most moving incident for me, and it taught me that warfare happens these days mostly among civilians. Civilians are often targeted. They're certainly often hit. And I realized that the difference between PTSD in a child and PTSD in an adult is just that in a child, it lasts longer.
Well, Britain gives aid for those children. And regardless of the fact Oxfam is alleging that the G20 arms sales dwarf the actual aid being given, I think the Oxfam report says that the G20 arms sales to Saudi are 3 times the humanitarian aid money. Surely you can't criticize the British government for its response to the Yemen humanitarian catastrophe because it gives so much aid.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm very much on the side of the people and the givers of aid and the agencies. Of course, well, let us give more aid, but let us be very careful about our military exports. They have to be. I think they should be stopped pending an international inquiry, which I think the United Nations might well carry out. I'm not for a moment criticizing the amount of aid that we give. I am criticizing our arms exports and the damage that they do.
But you've covered wars in your history of war reporting with the RAF. I mean, how is it possible that if the RAF are training these pilots, that the pilots could be accidentally, or is it deliberately, killing men, women and children in Yemen?
It's not only the Saudis, of course. There are the other countries in the coalition. I'm not going to criticize the RAF, but there would appear to be something wrong with the training, or something defective about it, if the targeting goes wrong so regularly. The point I'm making, these appear not to be isolated incidents, but they are part of a pattern of wrong targeting and indiscriminate targeting. And I accept that in modern warfare, there's no real distinction between soldiers and civilians because the war is fought among the civilians, and it's spread now since I was there to the port city of Hodeida and widely across the country. But I think that we cannot carry on as we have done. And I only wish I was still a member of Parliament, but I know there are plenty of MPs willing to raise this with the government.
Well, talking about Jeremy Corbyn was one who raised it quite a lot. He's in the news, Brexit's in the news, COVID is in the news. Can you understand why, despite UNICEF and NGOs trying to get this further up the mainstream media news agenda, it is failing to make the news in this country?
Yes, I do understand that. I watch news broadcasts still quite compulsively, at least one a day, and there's very little in them. Very little foreign news in them, very little about Yemen, the wars of Africa, the number of countries threatened now by famine. UN used to call it food insecurity, now it's famine. So the conflict in the Yemen is being fought in a context of sort of international darkness. And I do understand how having been a journalist, how the news agenda is taken over, captured, if you like, by the coronavirus. But it doesn't stop these humanitarian crises. In fact, the crisis is worsening in Yemen because of the coronavirus. These things interact.
Yeah, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine saying the deaths have doubled in Aden because of COVID. Tell me about the scale of the famine, because I know you saw famine when you were in Yemen, but the figures now are 24 million needing food assistance out of a population of, what, 30 million?
I think that clearly things are getting much worse. The infrastructure has collapsed. You can't have normal agriculture in the middle of a war. Millions of people are threatened with death by starvation, and I think hundreds of thousands may have died with it already. It's very hard to get the figures because of the crisis on the ground. Even the aid agencies don't have the access that they should. But satellite imagery is really worrying about the freshly dug graves of the victims of the coronavirus. You know, everything. Sometimes I felt when I was in Yemen that anything that could go wrong was going wrong. Add to that now the plague of coronavirus and the famine, and it's about as bad as as it can get. But how can we help? We help by foreign aid, of course. We help by helping the aid agencies, the UNICEF and the others looking after the children. And we, above all, help, I think, by stopping the supply of lethal weapons to the Saudi-led coalition, however much it costs us. The moral cost is too high.
But so what is the nature of the disconnect? Some might have thought you had become insensitized or desensitized by all the wars you've covered. But it is a fact that Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, signed off the selling of munition parts to Saudi Arabia days after civilian deaths were being reported of civilians. So why is it your perspective seems so different? You think it's so important, the arms sales, as opposed to the important aid that Britain is giving at the same time?
I think the answer to that is that over half a century, I've been caught up in, being a witness to or at the fringes of 19 wars. Boris, bless him, hasn't seen it. Neither has Liz Truss. I think I sometimes describe myself as a battle-softened veteran. I'm not actually a pacifist, though I'm some of the way there. But I have seen at first hand the misery and the destruction and the total damage that war causes. And I find it especially frustrating now. It's very difficult to get the attention of the world for anything else other than this great pestilence sweeping it. But the pestilence is worsening the plight of the Yemeni people. And we have to call a halt. We have to, somehow we got to draw attention to this.
Is it not only that they haven't seen the kind of things you've seen, is money in the equation? Because Britain and the British government apparently are fighting the judicial review after the resumption of weapons sales that fuel the conflict. There is a judicial review that campaigners are hoping for about weapons sales.
Yeah, of course, money is part of the equation. The British economy is quite significantly sustained by arms exports, not just, of course, to Saudi Arabia, but all over the world, and it's done by a special license. But again, I think that the moral imperative is so great that if there is a cost to the economy, I think it has to be borne. We claim to be a civilized people. Why are we arming, can I put it crudely, the gang that can't shoot straight? I'm still haunted by what I saw in Yemen. I was only there for a few days, but I saw children. I saw a child dying before my eyes for lack of medical attention. The death toll is unsustainable, and if there's a hit to the economy as a result, well, there's a hit to the economy. We claim to be a civilized nation. Civilized nations should not be doing what we're doing, and we're not the only one. Others are doing it as well.
Martin Bell, thank you. After the break. After a Putin-brokered ceasefire, we go to the heart of the frozen conflict that went hot, Nagorno-Karabakh, with award-winning journalist Peter Oborne. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground.